first PowerPoint. I know people are excited about PowerPoints, so 90s. I tried to do Zenio or something else, but anyway, we got my PowerPoint. So here we go. Flashback to the 90s.
Make that a little closer. I have a feeling that computer is precarious with.
Yes, I will.
Want the lights off?
No, it should be bright enough. But although,
Let me just wonder though, if people can see past this to where the
Yeah,
screen
that's
is.
better.
oh yeah, sorry about that. I didn't bring an extension cord, so it's a little problematic here. All right, well, Megan couldn't make it tonight, so I just put together a few slides.
I'm wondering if you might make more sense to put it on the table.
Okay.
Okay.
So I did a few slides on ecoterrorism. All right, so the green movement, the environmental movement, and the animal rights movement have been decidedly targeted by the FBI and others. And on the FBI's 10 most wanted terrorist lists, we've got one Daniel Santiago, Daniel Andreas Santiago. It's noted that he's a vegan, he won't eat animal products. He is on there for his alleged involvement in an Earth First bomb plot. It's Earth First. Everybody else on the terrorist list is wanted for actually killing people. This bomb plot didn't harm anybody, but well, you can't tell from the screen. Sorry, this is my first PowerPoint. Everybody else on there is Muslim, and they wanted to show their that they're not profiling, and so they stuck on an animal rights activist. So that's kind of the mindset of law enforcement, is that there is something called ecoterrorism, and that therefore environmental and animal rights activists are liable to be terrorists. And we've got an interesting development in recent years where ALEC, the American Legislative Council, Executive Council, has been helping the agriculture industry, which is losing money because of this damned trend toward vegetarianism and people eating less meat, and these darn animal rights activists who are sneaking onto factory farms, and photographing abusive animals and publicizing it. And so, in states across the country, more and more state legislatures are considering what we're calling Aggregate Laws, which this is phrasing from the Indiana bill. Farmers have the right to engage in agricultural operations free from the threat of terrorism. Going into a farm and photographing animals is terrorism. And what the laws do is criminalize people for taking unauthorized videos or pictures, and put pretty severe penalties on it. And in some states, everybody else is wanting to get into the act, so it's spreading to the timber industry, the mining or fracking industry, and manufacturing. And so so this is why, even if you're not an animal rights activist, they're kind of like the canary in the gold mine, showing us what we have to possibly deal with. As laws that are targeted specifically towards them work, they expand it. So that's what's going on in the states. Ag laws have passed in about 3 or 4 states, and they're being considered in probably a dozen or so more this legislative session, and there are different states in play across the country. Nationally, though, 7 years ago now almost, Congress passed the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And what this does is single out, for severe criminal punishment, people who are engaged in protesting animal enterprises, which is very vaguely defined in the bill, which is why, again, social justice, peace activists, everybody should be concerned about this bill. What it does is link economic loss to your political activity. So if you boycott, if PETA wants to launch a boycott against some shampoo company for testing on animals, and that shampoo company suffers losses, they could charge PETA under this Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and therefore the animal activists are being charged with terrorism for just doing a boycott, which is what we're supposed to be doing as activists. So this bill is a huge concern, and it kind of passed in the dark of the night. Dennis Kucinich is down there on the House floor yelling, no, we can't pass this, but it got passed under special rules, passed the House, moved through the Senate, signed by George Bush, and there we have it. Center for Constitutional Rights is fighting it in court. They were dealt a setback about a week and a half ago, and so we're kind of relaunching a campaign to get the law repealed nationally. It's an incredibly dangerous law. So what's been happening to environmental activists and animal rights activists, which is something that also Saqib could have talked about, is the communication management units, which are special units inside a couple of prisons out in the Midwest. There's one in Indiana and one in Illinois. I think there might also be one in Colorado, which is where they, it's like our own little Guantanamos here in the country. It's been used a lot for Muslim prisoners. It's also used a lot for people who are convicted of gang crimes. And the idea is just to not let people who are in these prisons communicate with people in the outside world. They're allowed to like have one letter a month. So two activists who have been in these units are Andy Stepanian, who was a member of the SHAC-7, which is Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty or something like that, targeting a specific corporation. What the SHAC-7 did was they had a website. They were not accused or convicted of actually doing anything. They had a website that talked about all the protests against this corporation. And they lauded these protests, and some of the protests were nasty, but they weren't accused of doing anything. This guy, Andy, gets, all 7 of them were convicted. Andy was, I think he spent maybe 2 years in prison, and about half a year he was stuck in the communication management unit, which is kind of like solitary confinement. And then Daniel McGowan, who's been in the news recently, he was convicted for a Earth Liberation Front action, some arson. He was put into jail, kept in a communications management unit. He was recently released into a halfway house in Manhattan, and he wrote a post on Huffington Post, if any of you saw it about 2 weeks ago, talking about what the communication management unit was like, and what he did some Freedom of Information Act requests and found out that he was put in there because of his politics. So he writes a blog post on this on Huffington Post, and then the Bureau of Prisons arrests him again, saying he's not allowed to do that. And CCR steps right in, and they're like, no, you can't do that, not in Bureau of Prisons. And they did manage to get him back out of prison in a matter of over a weekend. And so this is my WTF page. Tim DeChristopher, you all know Tim DeChristopher, right? Bidder number 70, thrown in jail for 2 years for bidding.
Actually, does everyone know what that is?
Do people? Oh, okay. He's a young activist who was concerned about there was a land auction that the federal government does. They auction off pristine, beautiful land so that people can drill. I think it was for oil at that particular auction. Tim was upset about it, so he bid on a couple parcels of land, and just to stop the oil drillers from being able to bid on it. And as the auction is over, he doesn't have the money to pay for it, so they arrest him.
He raises the money.
They raise the money, but still they won't let him pay, so they throw him to jail for 2 years. He's out now. And then the Shack 7 who were put into jail for running the website. Okay, so that's the end of the environmental green scare portion of this presentation. Now we'll move on to just the big old ball of wax and what we're up against as activists and who's so concerned about what we're doing and that we might succeed. So fusion centers. How many people know about fusion centers? This is where everybody comes to spy on us. This is where the FBI, the local law enforcement, the state law enforcement, ICE, and every law enforcement, possibly CIA, possibly NSA, and private partners. This is where the creeping fascism comes in. So I'm imagining in New York City, and I'm not imagining, we have documents that show this in New York City when Occupy started. The Fusion Center was very, very free with their information with all the corporations and banks and stuff that were going to be protested by Occupy. And that's a common thing that the Fusion Centers do. What gets me about the Fusion Centers is just their sheer idiocy, which Congress did a report on this and found out, yeah, they are idiots over there at the Fusion Centers. My favorite report that's been put out by a Fusion Center is probably the 2009 Virginia Terrorism Threat Assessment, which tagged, among other groups, the Girl Scouts, because they were doing a voter registration drive. What you need to know is the Girl Scouts were in Northern Virginia, and this was a Muslim troop that was registering Muslims. The other thing which you can't see on here is they have, this is like a 300-page report, and they go through different regions of Virginia, and they're concerned because there's so many colleges in Virginia, you know, those students, they can get out of hand. They specifically talk about the environmental movement in Virginia, and talk about one group, I can't remember the name of it, but they talk about all this terrorism this group has done and how many times they've been arrested for doing sit-ins at, you know, the local coal mine and that sort of thing. And then up here, there was also a fun report from the Central Texas Fusion Center that talked about how, well, Texas is being overtaken by Sharia, and these darn Islamic groups like CAIR are gaining political power, and we better watch out about it, or we're going to be like, I think the Detroit airport where they have foot baths for the taxi drivers. So that's what fusion centers are. They're ginning up fear. They're working with private partners. They're exchanging information. And this is one of the things that we were concerned about with the Maryland State Police is all the files about the activists that the Maryland police were labeling as terrorists. Did this go into the fusion centers? Did it get all over the place? And we still don't really have an answer to that, do we, Max? But we're assuming that.
Yeah, later I can expound. I debated the head of the fusion center at Pikesville Library 2 years ago.
Wow.
U.S. Attorney, by the way.
Okay, that'll be fun. Okay, the other thing is ICE, the Immigration and Customs, and the reason why they're watching us is because subsumed in their bureaucracy is the Federal Protection Agency, which is the people who have to protect the federal buildings. So these are just some of the reports that they put out. You can't read them, unfortunately, but it talks about, it's really their attempt to catalog all of the peace protests that are going to be happening